brings me to my third point, which is the privatization of information. So a lot of the information that the NSA is looking at is actually information not collected by the government, but information collected by Verizon or by Google or by Yahoo, private telecommunications companies that collect this information by virtue of their provision of certain services, telephone services, search engines, or whatever. So your entire search history, your email account, your Facebook account, your Twitter account, you no longer, if the courts want access to that, it's not asking the government to release the information, but actually asking a private company that owns that information. So what does that mean? I mean, FOIA becomes almost irrelevant, or it's if most of the information is in the hands of private entities. I mean, what does freedom of information mean? Because traditionally, the concept of freedom of information, dating back to the Enlightenment era, was information collected and kept by the government, right? So the government cannot release phone records because the government does not collect phone records. In the past, the government will release your FBI surveillance. Even now, no, if you yourself want to request your FBI file, you can ask the FBI to release it to you. But you cannot ask Verizon, you can probably, but you cannot do that with a private company, right? So it's weird. I think we are in a new era that's sort of unexplored, thinking about, if the most crucial information, especially on individuals, is controlled by not the public sector, but the private sector, what does that mean? And given yung data mining capabilities of, with new supercomputers, companies can actually predict where you're going to go, what you're going to do, predict your behavior as well as a history of your past behavior. In the past, Singapore lang yung may ganong capacity because Singapore was a small country. It was collecting information on all its citizens, every time they go through the central business district and their car passes there, may information and ganyan. But now even tollways are privatized and no longer subject to freedom of information. So that to me is the real dilemma. I mean, obviously, and these are global companies, so national laws really make no sense. Right? Because, if you want information from Google, you have to ask from Google. In the Philippines, you have to ask Google. And if Google decides, not a Philippine court. Even in the US, Google decides. Of course, in the US, merong silang the FISA courts can subpoena Google. But then Google decides whether it will follow court subpoenas or not. So these are companies that are almost, above. Of course, usually they want your business, like in China, they comply. But in other countries, I don't know, So, and yung Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, they're libertarians for the most part. They want no government regulation. So they're very socially liberal, so therefore gay marriage and environmental issues, and for immigration, they're very socially liberal. But in the sort of regulatory front, they're very libertarian. They don't want any government intervention at all in the way they do business. So they're opposing all of these attempts to restrict their businesses in their gathering and collection and selling and mining of information. So that's where we are at the moment. So I don't know really how to conclude this and what relevance this is to the Philippines, but maybe that's one of the things we should be considering. In the end, I think, a lot of it depends on us. It's what matters. The information that will be made available is information that matters to society and to key constituencies. What is secret and what is not secret, what is open is the boundaries are continually shifting and they're permeable. And now, on one hand, there's increasing demand. For example, in the realm of corporate disclosures, especially with these offshore companies, because it's not just information that's crossing borders freely, it's also money. And it's very difficult now to regulate financial flow, especially with these offshore havens. It's very hard for me to find out, for example, how much a citizen in my country should be paying in taxes when most of the wealth is hidden in offshore companies that are non-transparent. So there's now a movement among the, in the European Union to compel more corporate transparency. Because even in the US, the US actually SEC in the Philippines is better. Kasi dito, every company is required to disclose, at least on paper, who are the shareholders and the directors, diba? In the US, private companies are not compelled to do that. They're only asked to, if only public companies, those that are listed in the stock exchange. So if you look for a company there, you will only find the registered agent. If they choose to reveal their directors, it will be there. But there's no way you can penetrate the secrecy of private companies in the US. And though there have been attempts to legislate much more regulation of private companies, businesses have been resisting this. So all of this, Google and Yahoo, they're all over the world. And it's very hard to keep track of what they're doing because of this wall of corporate secrecy. But there have been attempts to break that, and there may be sort of new global conventions that will address that. But for us, in the absence, given, there is a FOIA law is important, but there are other international instruments that will now that we can use also as part of the struggle for freedom of information. One of it is the UN Convention Against Corruption. Because the UN Convention actually mandates that certain categories of information be made publicly available. So financial disclosures, information related to procurement, you know this more than me, all of that now, the UN Convention, and the Philippines is a signatory to that convention. So even if there's, of course we have a constitution, but there's recourse to international conventions, and maybe those are the things, the next sort of struggle would be looking at international agreements and international conventions and how these can be used for freedom of information. So there's also emerging now some new attempts to regulate the disclosure of information on revenues from natural resources. Well, we have natural gas, but oil, mining, etc. So there's sort of a global movement for that also. So it's really a globalized world. Information crosses borders much more easily. Regulation has so far not been able to keep pace with this globalization of information or financial flows for that matter. The conventions and the international agreements lag very far behind, but that's one area of struggle or whatever that perhaps we should consider.